Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Santa Rosa, California today. And as I'm typically joined by Bob, Bob is off on assignment and not able to join us today. But I am joined by a good friend and comrade, Lauren Regan, the executive director and senior staff attorney at the Civil Liberties Defense Center. Lauren is a national expert in the defense of political activists, particularly those engaged in climate, environmental, indigenous, animal rights movements. And so today we're going to be talking about Atlanta and the recent developments that happened last week, where Georgia State and Atlanta police served a warrant on the Atlanta Solidarity Committee. As folks know from some of the previous shows we've done, things have seriously escalated in Atlanta over the last 6 months or so, including the murder of a forest defender, Tortuguita. 34 have been charged with domestic terrorism, but activists are fighting a project that they've been resisting, which is called Cop City, tooth and nail, and have made headway with even a recent poll showing that 51% of Atlanta's area residents oppose the project, while only 34% support it. And then also recent revelations have shown us that the Atlanta Police Foundation and other proponents have greatly downplayed the cost of the project to the public. And so that's all sort of happening all here at once. But Lauren, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Yeah, totally. Maybe we could just actually start with just a little bit of for folks who aren't familiar with what happened with the Atlanta Solidarity Committee last week, maybe give us just a bit of a brief background on that, and then maybe if there's any updates.
Sure. I think maybe we could start by saying that over the last month or two, many of us have been listening in on these bond hearings that have been happening in the state courts. We had several people arrested and charged for attending a music festival back in March. Many of them spent extensive time in jail. In fact, a couple of folks that were arrested from those dates were just released on Friday, right at the almost 90-day mark of being in pretrial custody without bond, solely because they were charged and, of course, not convicted of these domestic terror laws that you mentioned. And so at each one of these bond hearings, it's been really interesting to listen to these district attorneys concoct and string together half-truths and exaggerated claims that they're hoping will manipulate and convince a judge to deny bond and to keep people in jail. And the state's primary purpose, in my opinion, in keeping people in jail, of course, is to scare activists from daring to even come to Atlanta to stand in solidarity with this resistance. Their hope is that by seeing your comrades jailed for 30, 60, almost 90 days without being convicted of a crime, that people will think twice about coming to Atlanta as activists. And so at each one of these hearings, we're hearing sort of a different part of a story from the prosecutor. And the last several hearings, the prosecutor has gone off on these tangents that seemed to be sort of beating a drum regarding financial crimes, and started bringing up ties to bail funds and jail support. And I'm sure your listeners remember that when folks were originally arrested at that music festival, the cops and the state of Georgia stated that having the jail support number written on your arm was actually evidence of domestic terrorism. So we've been seeing a lot of
mud on your shoes, right?
Mud on your shoes, yeah. There were a slew of pretty asinine statements, but we've seen this. This is something that we've all been aware of. And so the folks that have been involved in the Solidarity Fund and the Network for Strong Communities have been well aware that state repression right now and right there in Georgia, doesn't have to have any basis in fact or law for them to be, making attacks against the community. And they were well braced for the reality that at some point the state was going to come for structures of support. We saw the state starting to make allegations about jail support, and a jail support structure, and trying to criminalize calling jail support, even though everybody involved with jail support, is doing completely lawful work and is very well aware that every communication that they have with people in jail is being recorded and being provided to the state. So, to think that like jail support is going to be doing anything overtly criminal is pretty laughable. And the same is true with the financial structures that are underpinning political movements on the left today. They are very well lawyered and counseled and advised to ensure that because they are, doing work that has a lot of state spotlight being shown upon it, that they are doing everything, to the letter of the law. And they also were well aware that despite all of those facts, that they could likely be rounded up, which in essence is what happened last Wednesday, where, very early in the morning, SWAT team shows up, guns a-blazing, and arrests 3 of the board members of the Solidarity Fund, who have been very long time community activists. These are folks with some experience under their belts, and they were hauled off to jail and charged under Georgia state law with quote unquote money laundering and quote unquote charity fraud. Luckily we had already retained them, one of the best lawyers in the state of Georgia. He did a fantastic job at the bond hearing on Friday, and all 3 were released on bond Friday afternoon and are now.
And just real quick, back to the, military SWAT style raid of where they were, that is not something we typically see with people who are charged with like quote unquote, like white collar crimes, right? Like money laundering or, charity fraud or anything like that. And so there's also like a sort of, shock and awe that they were trying to play out here as well, correct?
Absolutely. Normally nonprofit offenses are the types of things where the organization is notified. The organization's lawyer gets on the phone with, somebody from the AG's office, and, if they really are going to allege criminal conduct, there's like okay, bring them in next Wednesday and we'll have them arraigned, and then we'll move forward with, these financial crime allegations. So yeah, it is very, very unusual for that type of police response. It certainly is part of their fantasy concoction that this movement, they continue to take a bunch of actions and say a bunch of words, trying their hardest to some way justify this, domestic terror designation. They are repeatedly claiming falsely that folks involved in Atlanta Forest Defense have been designated as a violent extremist entity by the feds, which is not the case and has been, proven multiple times by journalists. But yet, even in these arrest affidavits for the Solidarity Fund folks, they continue to repeat that lie. The other kind of interesting / funny, if it wasn't so problematic, thing that happened at the bond hearing is that the judge himself was like, said things like, there's not a lot of meat on this bone. And, something like, these are fairly paltry, accusations. And it's true, when you look at the arrest warrants, they're basically making allegations that one of the board members reimbursed themselves $322 for yard signs, for food for a public meeting. And I think the total
camping gear was one I saw too.
right. Clearly tools of armed insurrection. And I think the total dollar amount was like $7,000.
I also saw Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp's statement, which was completely ridiculous. If it'd be hilariously ridiculous if it wasn't so scary. But he said that the state would track down every member of a criminal organization, from violent foot soldiers to their uncaring leaders. I mean, it sounds like he's talking about ISIS or something like that.
Yeah, uncaring leaders are 3 humans that are like full-time volunteers in their community and do everything from like feed unhoused people to like make sure that, people get bailed out pre-trial. That's the uncaring humans that he's referring to. But yeah, that was pretty, ridiculous also. And, what I have been kind of telling people is like, the more outrageous and far-fetched and ridiculous their statements are, the more we should all realize that there really isn't any merit underpinning the state's rhetoric. People will ask me like, is what's going on in Atlanta coming to my town next, or my movement or my campaign? And generally speaking, what I tell them is, no, I think that this is an aberrant scenario right now playing out in Georgia, in part because of the politics of Georgia itself, and in part because the target of this political movement is Cop City. You are literally taking on the militarized state industrial complex, basically. You are trying to take on a powerful police union, as well as a cop shop that's going to train cops all across the US and around the world. Like, they're going to double down. Like, what's their graceful exit to this? It's not like a developer building a condo, that loses a land use hearing. I mean, so, I don't necessarily think that this is going to be the new normal. I also think that, what we haven't really seen fully yet is the price tag that state repression is costing the state, and what ultimately it is, it's going to end result in.
Well, and in the intro, I talked about how there's been these revelations. I think that they had sold the Cop City to the Atlanta City Council for like 30 million, and now it's being revealed that I think it's as high as 60 million.
Yeah, that's right. I think 67 million right now. Yeah.
And looking at particularly in the escalation since I would say December or January, I mean, how much more of like money is the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta spending on this heavily militarized response to people doing things like handing out flyers or sitting in hammocks in trees.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And so this strategy where they're targeting this bail fund and the solidarity committee with, white collar crimes, the kind that you would go after, like a drug organization or someone on, an illicit financial organization, like thinking like Wall Street, where I've also seen the use of, the domestic terror charge, which I think in Georgia came about as a result of like a response to right-wing mass shootings. And we're just seeing like a lot of brutality. Like every time you listen to something about Cop City, it's like they're beating up protesters just because they can. And how does this all sort of fit in? This is a state response to just like shut down this movement. That's what they want to do, is they want to eradicate direct action, environmental direct action, environmental protests, that sort of thing, and then protest against Cop City.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that we're seeing sort of a doubling down on like use of force and sort of the police state tactics in Cop City is because it really is intersectional, movement work. You've got environmental justice activists, climate activists, you've got land defenders, you've got, Black community leaders, like there's a preschool collective, all using very different strategies and tactics, but all with the same end goal. And they have worked together very well, even though this is an autonomous movement that, some of the factions are quite radical, compared historically to other, environmental and climate activists. So I think that intersectionality and sort of the growing popularity and growing momentum of the movement to stop Cop City has been very intimidating to the state. I think there's also just something to some of these Southern tropes around outsiders, which kind of flies in the face of like the history of the civil rights movement and the freedom riders and, Northerners coming into Southern places to stand in solidarity with activists.
Reconstruction, all echoes, the Northern carpetbagger.
Exactly. And we're seeing and hearing those same tropes coming out of the mouths of, modern officials at this time.
The irony, I'm going to channel Bob Bazenko here for a minute, is that, Bob would really like to point out now that it's this Democratic Black leadership in Atlanta, the mayor and many people on the city council who, probably their parents and grandparents were part of, the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King. And now they're acting the sort of inverse of what, happened back in the 50s and 60s in Atlanta.
Yeah. At some point you should have somebody on from the, Atlanta Press Collective, the ACPC, because they have done quite a bit of investigative journalism around sort of this dual class, Black political structure that is beyond my pay grade to explain right now. But it was a really interesting story, and as a Northerner that's now a Northwesterner, I was pretty oblivious to. But, so I think that is also going on. I think we saw throughout Black Lives Matter, some of the most unconstitutional fascist elements coming out of police unions and like the abuse of power that we know occurs in police unions all around the country. Those are the entities that are responsible for trying to get cops that murder humans their jobs back, cops that rape people on duty. The union is the one that's trying to get their job back. And, generally I'm a huge union supporter, but police unions are only unions in name. I think they're almost using the name for their own protection. And, the Atlanta Police Foundation is a story to tell in and of itself.
Right.
The level of problem that exists within that union or in that police foundation, it could write its own dramedy, I would have to say. And they are the financial backers of this project. They are sort of ground zero for a lot of it. And, they are wielding a lot of power, both back channel and front channel. And I think that they have a lot of responsibility on their hands.
On the Green and Red podcast, we like to say we're pro-union except cop union.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right.
Hey, folks, you're listening to the Green and Red podcast, where we interview guests like Noam Chomsky and Andrew Bacevich. We also have shows on cultural icons like Johnny Cash and Woody Guthrie and the Godfather movies. And we talk to scores of organizers and activists who tell us what is happening in the streets and in the back country. So check us out.
Yeah, and I'm Bob Bazenko, and as always, Scott and I want to thank you for listening, for watching, for supporting us, and we hope we continue to do that. The first thing we ask is that you share this, let people know that we're out there and we're doing something that I think is different. We have a good niche, I think, in Left podcast, and we talk to really cool people and about really important issues. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Go to our webpage, which is on in the screen, and if you really like us, and if you have a little extra change around, jingles or folds, you can help us out by
going to our website at greenandredpodcast.org and hitting that support button and make a one-time donation, or you can check us out at patreon.com/greenredpodcast and become a patron. We'll see you again real soon. My other question is, this is kind of going into some like national developments on this front. We're seeing a lot of anti-protest legislation being passed, mostly in red states nationally. Georgia, I would say probably the legislature is still like fairly right wing, but the state is definitely shifting towards a purple and even blue state. But how do you think what's going on around Cop City and Atlanta really ties in with what's happening in this other parts of the country with anti-protest legislation and all of that? And I know that you've done some work on that.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parts to it. I think with regard to some of these quote unquote domestic terror statutes and some of the anti-protest statutes, they are in part a backlash to defund, and sort of ACAB and, all of those things that became common vernacular after 2020 as a result of George Floyd uprisings. I also think that the far right extremists and the corporations that they are one and the same with have spent a lot of time concocting legislation for themselves. American Legislative Exchange Council is just one of many, but they have been doubling down for over a decade on state legislatures and really targeting state statutes and state laws. And it's not surprising to me anyway, that whether it's big industry, prisons, cops, big pharma, big ag, all of them are kind of sharing a playbook at this point on trying to dig back some of the losses in the court of public opinion. I think that just looking at the climate movement, in general, like the Oil and Gas Journal, wrote that the number one threat to the continued viability of their profits was reputational harm caused by the climate movement, period.
Right.
And so how do they counter that? Well, they either file a slap suit so they can completely control the narrative in a way that they can't with the media any longer, or they buy legislation that basically tries to convince some normal people that, well, if it's a crime, it must be corporation good, activist bad. I think it's sort of just this like desperado attempt at tipping the scales back in a way that I think mass movements, climate, environment, social justice movements have sort of been winning over the years, in part because, we're clearly going down the drain pretty quick.
They probably didn't like it in June of 2020 when there was a poll that came out where 54% of Americans actually thought that the whatever precinct it was in Minneapolis should have been burned down.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Or when the NBA was about to go on strike in response to the murder of George Floyd and the murders that happened, I think, in Kenosha around with Kyle Rittenhouse, et cetera. This is all part of the defund movement, right? Part of the defund narrative as well. And the Democrats are throwing more money at the police than even the Republicans at this point.
And like the shrinking of mass media, the shrinking in the number of journalists even has made it so that corporations and their industries can't really control media narrative in the same way that they used to be able to.
Right.
So I think that there is, like, regardless of how they tried to clamp down on those sources, there's just so many other sources that they're coming up with. What they do still control are legislatures, and prisons, in jails. And so, we're kind of seeing them kind of holding on to what they have left and really trying to exploit it. And so I think a lot of those laws are, coming out of that. Now, the other thing that, I'm seeing as somebody who has defended activists for 25 years is when it comes time for prosecutors to file charges against activists, they're often not using these new laws that have been passed. Or if they file charges, they're filing critical energy infrastructure, blah, 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 and they're filing a trespass charge. And then at some point, they are offering a plea offer that says, plea to trespass, do some community service, and this goes away, kind of a deal too good to pass up. And so then the defendant takes that deal, and we don't get to go in and challenge the constitutionality of that bigger charge. And so it stays on the books, but it has never really been tested. And that is sort of something that we've seen for a long time with regard to a lot of these kinds of laws. Ultimately, if they actually do prosecute somebody with them, and they actually go to court, we've had a lot of movement lawyers successfully challenging the constitutionality of these statutes and either getting parts or whole statutes ruled to be unconstitutional and stricken from the books.
And that's what they're afraid of, right? They don't want the laws knocked off the books or nullified, whatever.
Right.
Neutralized.
With it, like I said, like when it's on the books, they don't really even have to use it to sort of get the play they want out of it, which is sort of deterrence, but also trying to like take that moral high ground back, And so if the law is ruled to be unconstitutional and is stricken from the books, then that sort of like exposes their overzealous, authoritarian attempt to really shut down what is truly First Amendment protected.
I read an article in The Guardian that said that maybe it was on the same day as the Atlanta Solidarity Committee arrests, that a case had been actually filed challenging the domestic terror law in Georgia.
Yeah, so a movement lawyer has filed a habeas corpus motion on behalf of his young client, Georgia native, who is charged with domestic terrorism, coming out of those March raids right before Tortuguita was killed. And in that habeas corpus, they are challenging the constitutionality of the statute. And that was like a major, kind of group effort by a bunch of different movement lawyers that put that together. And the reason that they filed it as a habeas corpus motion, which kind of means bring the body in front of the judge, is Latin that. But the reason that vehicle is being used in Georgia is because under Georgia criminal procedure, they have like 4 years to indict a person and actually formally charge them with a crime. And until they have actually issued an indictment, which is just a fancy word for like the charging instrument, it's what officially starts a felony case up. And right now we have no indictments in Atlanta at all for anyone. And as a result of that, most of the time, criminal defense lawyers can't bring those challenges, can't challenge the constitutionality of the domestic terror law because it's not time yet. They have to wait for the state to file the papers and say, here is what we are charging. And then we can say, okay, great. Now we're going to challenge everything you've just charged. But by bringing that habeas corpus, they're able to say, like, even though this person is not indicted yet, they are suffering harm as a result of the mere charging. And, we are seeing that, we've had folks that have faced expulsion from school. We've had folks facing expulsion from housing. We've had a couple of the shitty main banks close a couple of bank accounts as a result of domestic terror charges. So there have been collateral consequences, and not to mention just the fear of living your young life with a felony charge that carries a 20-year prison sentence with it.
I mean, it does seem like kind of hearing that, it seems like a big element here from the state or whatever is just like is a sort of political charged way to make sure that there's no opposition to Cop City.
Yes. Since the very beginning, since the very first arrests, we just saw really bizarre charges. Even from the very beginning, like people showing up at a corporate executive's office and being charged with felony burglary or terroristic threats. That's not normally what we see for office demos in
Right.
land.
Right. Or people getting felony, I think it was stalking charges for going near a cop who was maybe involved in the murder of Tortuguita's home and putting out flyers with their name on.
Leafleting three
Yeah.
people basically on a public street in a neighborhood where a cop lives. Yeah.
Right. One other thing on this is, do you think this will spark a trend where other police and prosecutors are going to get excited about charging people with domestic terror? Last week in New York, some Justice for Jordan Neely protesters were arrested for disrupting the New York subway, and NYPD gave them domestic terror charges. The charges were dropped by the Manhattan DA because they're too busy prosecuting Trump or whatever. But do you think this will spark a trend with law enforcement?
I think it really depends on how this is going to play out for Georgia. If this becomes a tactic that silences this movement and people are afraid and they don't show up and they don't stand in solidarity, then the state is going to see that this is an effective move for them, and they're going to share that playbook, and you're going to see it more and more. But if this is a situation, similar to like Standing Rock, where instead of that happening, the movement redoubles itself and people are showing up more and more and more, in solidarity, then I think that it's a tactic that others are going to see, caused a shameful black eye on, the state of Georgia, cost them millions and millions of dollars. And what did they get out of it? They don't really have a whole lot to show for it with regard to accountability to their taxpayers. So, we'll see how it plays out. I really hope that it's the latter, and that, they will not view this as a tactic that they should sell to other places to be used and abused.
Right.
Obviously, the Supreme Court is not a real friendly place to think about legal challenges, ending up there. But, right now we do still have this thing called a First Amendment that does protect assembly as well as speech. And there is just a weird patchwork of laws that are being passed in states around the country that are systematically trying to shrink that civic space, and shrink the breadth of which, we have to sort of dissent and protest and exercise rights. And, it's scary and chilling, but also kind of important to fight back against, because if we don't, then we just kind of lose it without even fighting for it.
I guess that would be like my final question for people who are feeling that chill effect, who the inciting of fear may have an impact on them. Is there any sort of message you want to close on how people should, respond to the chill effect or to the fear that the state is trying to instill in all of us?
Well, I mean, I will say, like, first, it's been overwhelming to see the number of organizations around the country who have been posting statements in solidarity with the Solidarity Fund over the last few days.
Right.
And the National Bail Fund Network immediately stepped up. Like, there hasn't been a lost breath since the moment these folks were arrested. And so if the state thought that they were going to shut down Atlanta's bail support, or the movement against Cop City, in Atlanta, they were certainly shown quite a different way that played out. And And so I think it's a great example that, when they come for one of us, they come for all of us. An attack on one is an attack on all. And just because you may not be in Atlanta, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be paying attention. And there are a million different ways to stand in solidarity with people who are being attacked by the state. And we can all do something. And that chorus that's growing louder and louder, will hopefully eventually deafen the state. And maybe that combined with the mayor pulling the plug on Cop City could make for a joyous summer vacation for all of us.
A great victory to inspire everyone to go do more things like this.
That's right. Yeah. Being diverse, but also being strategic.
Right.
And having structures in place to make sure that your peeps are okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say, just to our audience, I would definitely encourage, we've done at least one show on the Bell Support Fund post 2020 last year. And I would definitely encourage all of our audience who are activists and organizers to get familiar with how things like bail funds work and how to do legal support and jail support. Because, even if you don't want to go be on the front lines, there's definitely a lot of things that you can do to support. So, Lauren, I want to thank you for joining me today. And I want to thank you for all the work you do all the time. Folks, you've been listening to Lauren Regan, the Executive Director and Senior Staff Attorney at the Civil Liberties Defense Center. We've been talking about the recent developments in Atlanta around Stop Cop City and the arrest of the Atlanta Solidarity Committee. If you like what you're hearing, check Green and Red Podcast out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're viewing this on YouTube, hit that support button. If you're listening to this on one of the podcast platforms, please give us a rate and review. It helps us with the algorithms. And if you want to support the Green and Red Podcast, check us out at greenandredpodcast.org and hit the support button and make a one-time donation, or go to Patreon and become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast.
And member like myself.
Be a patron just like Lauren of the Green and Red Podcast. And until then, everyone else should go out and misbehave and make trouble. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Scott.